April, and I'm the coordinator for IAED in the United States. And I'm the moderator for today's program that is being brought to you by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is one of the core associations of the Universal Peace Federation. So our association's mission is to attract and develop innovative business, government, and economic thought leaders who can collectively impact society and lead to the creation of a global environment that's conducive to mutual prosperity between nations and between individuals within that nation, so both on the macro and on the microeconomic scale. So our world's problems may seem sometimes too great and complex to solve. We see endemic violence, climate change, affordable housing, food insecurity, wealth and income disparity, and so on. Well, the topic today seems to be particularly relevant given the current conflict that has erupted in recent days in Sudan, a country that one of our speakers today has particularly close ties with. So the path towards solution lies in creative partnerships that break through those traditional biases and prejudices and bring together activists and leaders across perspectives and disciplines. So the topic explores broadening wealth creation and economic development through the collaboration of public, private, and philanthropic or social sectors. And the program is divided into two parts today, both theory and practice. But first, we're going to hear from Professor Eimicke, who's going to explain some of the theory of social value investing, which provides a 5-point management framework to assist leaders in developing and measuring the success of these cross-sector partnerships. And then we're going to hear from Mr. Magdi Amin, who will talk about his practical experience in researching, funding, and implementing a variety of cross-sector partnerships in the Horn of Africa. So let me introduce our first speaker today, Dr. William Eimicke. He's the professor of practice in international and public affairs and founding director of the Picker Center at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. So he teaches a course in management, cross-sector partnerships, applied policy analysis, and innovation. Dr. Eimicke is co-author, together with Howard Buffett, of the book, A Social Value Investing, a Management Framework for Effective Partnerships. So Dr. Eimicke, could you please begin your presentation and share your screen when you're ready?
Thank you very much, Roger. I just was reminded, my thoughts took me back to South Korea and the conference when we first started to discuss this topic just before the pandemic hit. And we've had an opportunity to discuss this several times before, so I'm very grateful to you and the organization for giving us the opportunity to expand this conversation. I will share my slide and we'll try to keep, unlike my ilk faculty, we never know when to be quiet, so I'll try to time myself and keep myself on track. So here are my slides. Let me put it in slideshow mode, and here we go. So social value investing, as Roger introduced, this is a concept that Howard Buffett and I, and that is the Howard Buffett of the Buffett family of Omaha, Nebraska. It is actually Warren's grandson who became my student in 2006, the year that his grandfather gave all his money away. He has since accumulated even more money than he had in 2006, which he's also in the process of giving away. And over the course of the last almost decade and a half, Howard and I have worked on the idea that, as Roger rightly pointed out, we face major challenges in the world: climate change, affordable education for all, healthcare for all, housing, inequality. Traditionally, we thought many of us thought that government was responsible for doing this, or charitable organizations where government didn't step in. But too often we ignored the important role of the private sector and how private sector innovation, efficiency, economy could be very effective partners in solving some of these important questions. Traditionally, we think about the world in three separate spheres: public, government, private, for-profit, and social, charitable, or nonprofit organizations. We think that this collaborative part of the Venn diagram has the most potential for solving these complex, important issues that we have globally. So what is it? It was inspired by value investing, which was actually invented by two professors here at Columbia University in the 1920s, Benjamin Graham and David Dodd. And they came up with the idea of investing long-term in stocks that had intrinsic value. And when we explored, Howard and I explored the idea of applying that strategy to the public sector, we came up with 5 principles that would enable organizations from the public, private, and nonprofit sector to collaborate together. And these 5 areas I'll talk about briefly as we go through this talk, but just to play them, they're 5 Ps, so they're hopefully a little bit easier to remember: process, people, place, portfolio, and performance. And we began with the framework and then looked around the world to see if there were ideal examples of this kind of cross-sector approach to what are essentially public or social problems. And in fact, we found quite a bit. In many places, some might be surprising. So what do we mean by each one of the 5 Ps? By process, we mean investing in a program or project that's implemented by a variety of partners focused on a comprehensive and fully integrated cross-sector approach. In essence, a strategic plan based on an issue that is collaboratively approached by 3 or more partners, one from each of the key sectors of society. So that's the process P. An example, which perhaps in our Q&A we can talk about, is really the pioneers of telemedicine in the world, which is Apollo Hospitals, a huge private for-profit hospital system based in India, and their collaboration with the Indian government, both at the federal, state, and local level, to make healthcare affordable to people in even the most remote places of India. And they started this experimentation in the early 2000s and have reached by far the world's most sophisticated system of telemedicine, again, cross-sector partnering. And in fact, when COVID hit, and we'll learn more about this as the data comes in, but India per capita had more success with getting people to be vaccinated and to not get the disease at all, but once they got it, to treat them in a way that enabled them not to spread the disease to other people. So they're a great example of the process P. People, here we're talking about leadership, but leadership in a fairly complicated set of structures, because we're talking about 3 organizations working on the same issue. Those of you who are involved in management, like I am, it's hard enough to get the people who work directly for you and are paid directly for you to do what you want when you want them to do it. Now we're talking about trying to coordinate that across multiple organizations and in multiple places. It requires a different kind of leader. Leaders who focus on collaboration, sharing, standardizing operating procedures across organizations. So when we come to this cross-sector partnership type of process, we're talking about a new, modern, collaborative leader. Here in New York, we have a great example of this, where we built now the second most visited public space in the East Coast, which is called the High Line. It's a public park. It's owned by the government, but it was created on private land, and the development is actually funded by private sector real estate in the area, and it's run by a not-for-profit social organization. All of the proceeds necessary to run the park on a daily basis come from the revenues generated by the businesses in the area and by contributions from people who joined the organization Friends of the High Line. The third P is place. And I think in many ways, the unique contribution of the social value investing methodology is the idea that these approaches need to be place-based and place-focused, so that the people who are most directly impacted, take, for example, the High Line, that the community where this initiative is taking place are engaged in both the development of the plan and the implementation of the plan, and is modified, particularly if it's a multi-area project, to fit best the place in which it's located. Once again, a focus on collaboration and cooperation. There's a great example of this in Brazil, where large private corporations, the CEOs, put up funding of their own to help spread community-based healthcare treatment centers and to modernize those treatment centers. So the clinics themselves were operated and owned by local governments across Brazil, but they were very short of the finances necessary to build state-of-the-art facilities. And they didn't have access to the best architects, consultants, design and construction companies. So the private sector united in a kind of corporate approach, signed an agreement with a number of cities across Brazil, and working together, they modernized 15 clinics around major cities in Brazil that were provided to the communities, providing state-of-the-art healthcare to people of limited means. The fourth P is what we call portfolio. And one of the advantages of this multi-sector approach is that resources can be blended. There's no question in our minds that government is the key funder, the big organization. The United States is the most privatized economy in the world. But even in the United States, about 50% of our gross national product is government funds. So government has to be in the mix, but government itself is not sufficient. So putting the public funds together with both philanthropy and charitable and social dollars and private sector dollars can finance projects that otherwise would not be feasible. And we'll take another quick stop at Brazil, one of the most exciting, I believe, museums in the world, which is totally based on environmental sustainability. It's an interactive museum. The idea came from actually the philanthropic center. The funds initially came almost exclusively from corporations, but the actual ongoing resources to operate what's called the Museum of Tomorrow comes from the government. The government also built a above ground rail system that takes people back and forth to the museum from hotels and residential sectors of Rio de Janeiro. It is now the second most visited tourist attraction in all of Brazil. And then the final P is performance measurement. And Peter Drucker, I learned management from Peter Drucker, and he famously often said, you can't effectively manage anything unless you measure it. And a key element, particularly in a cross-sector partnership arrangement, is there has to be common measures of success. And we have an example here in New York of rethinking how we do emergency response. In the fire department and EMS of New York, the traditional measurement of success was how quickly we got to events. It's important, but it's not sufficient. And in fact, we would argue what would be even better is if we could prevent these either health or fire or accident-related incidents before they happened. And through a cross-sector partnership initially between IBM and the fire department and several communities around New York, we developed a new kind of inspection system, which we call risk-based inspection, where the fire department proactively goes out and visits sites based on the risk of either a health emergency or a fire or accident-based emergency. And it's been able to reduce the number of incidents, serious incidents in New York by a significant amount over the 5 years that this system's been fully operational. So what social changes can social value investing affect? Clearly, climate change. We see some partnerships around the world where government is working with the private sector to convert trash, unsorted trash, into jet fuel, which has all sorts of positive environmental impacts, both from the negative impacts of landfills and trash and the disease that they cause, and producing fuel for airplanes that does not require fossil fuel. Affordable housing, which is a global urban problem. The High Line is a great example, and this is happening around the world in major cities, where the public sector uses its power of zoning, the private sector its ability to build units in an efficient and effective and rapid manner, but agreeing to mix the units in these buildings to have 30 or more % of the units available to people of modest means and modest income. In healthcare, these partnerships between private hospitals and public sector, in India is the best, but we're seeing examples of this now across the globe, here in the US, in South America, where private hospitals and government collaborate to serve clients of all incomes. In education, many of you have probably heard of the Khan Academy, which is a nonprofit organization that works with children around the world to supplement the public education system. And we've done some of that here at Columbia as well. And then finally, in urban transportation, coordinating private bus systems, car services, public transportation, and even individuals' bikes and walking to provide a more comprehensive and environmentally friendly urban transportation system. So that's the introduction to the theory of social value investing and cross-sector partnership. And I'll stop here and turn it back to Roger.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation. I have a couple of questions for you, but I'm going to come back to you at the end of the presentation after we hear from Mr. Amin. So our next presenter is Mr. Magdi Amin. Mr. Amin is the co-founder and managing partner of African Renaissance Partners and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So African Renaissance Partners is a venture capital firm. It's based in Washington, DC, Addis Ababa, and Khartoum. So we've got 3 offices, and it backs entrepreneurs that are working to transform the Horn of Africa by using technology to solve major development challenges such as access to finance, renewable energy, logistics, education, health, and agricultural productivity. So some of these are things that Dr. Eimicke just mentioned in his presentation. So after 2 decades working with the World Bank and IFC, Magdi joined the transitional government of Sudan in January of 2000 as a senior advisor to the Minister of Finance. He supported economic reforms to stabilize the economy, regain access to multilateral financial institutions, restructure Sudan's external debt, and create broad-based growth throughout the country. So I think he has a lot of practical experience in being able to talk to this subject. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Magdi, if you'd like to share your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. This is I really appreciate the invitation. A great organization. You know, I'm very much aligned with the mission, and thank you, Roger and Dr. Eimicke, for your words and good introduction. So I'm gonna go ahead and make sure I'm sharing the right presentation. There's always a few of them on.
That's looking good.
All right, great. So we know the Horn, and you know the news today this week is very disappointing. You know, and it's just a continuation of a long-standing cycle. I think the region has just gone through cycles of conflict and poverty that are kind of intertwined. Speaking of Sudan, which is the one that's in the news today, there was it gained independence in 1956. I think the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence post-colonial. And it was born a democracy, but then it was a military coup that finally ended in a popular revolution in 1964. My father was in the government at that time, and he came to the U.S. To help prepare for a presidential visit to John F. Kennedy. So there was that government was sort of overthrown. Then a period of democracy prevailed, only to be overthrown again by another military coup in 1969. A guy named Jafar al-Nimeri. By that time, we had gone back to Sudan, but then for different political reasons, we left again in the early 70s, and I largely grew up in the US as a result. That Nimeri stayed around until 1985 when the people overthrew him, only to then be overthrown by another military coup, Omar al-Bashir, who then, of course, led the Darfur conflict and many other things, civil war with the South Sudan, and a very repressive regime overall, only to finally be overthrown by the people in the December 2018, ultimately actually removed from power in 2019, which was the government that I came to participate in 2020 for about almost 2 years. There was a lot of progress, but it was actually a transitional period between the military and the civilians. And when it was time to start handing power over to civilians for the second half of the transition, the military stepped in because they, I guess for many reasons, they didn't like some of the reforms, some of the accountability that was being introduced. And they basically took over, arrested the prime minister. So it was effectively a military coup, even though they were already part of the government. And we were about to go back into a transition. Negotiations have been going on for a year. And the final issue was security sector reform and integrating some of the multiple, particularly one very large military entity. And it's these two generals that then opened up into conflict. And I'm taking a little bit of time to explain because it's quite distressing. This is a time where, especially for Muslims, it should be, peace and contemplation, but it was a shock, and people weren't expecting it. And I have relatives who are saying that they just agreed a humanitarian 24-hour period for people to go get food. But until then, people were actually worried about starving in their own homes because one of these two military entities has occupied large parts of Khartoum and breaking into houses and looting. South Sudan, also known for perhaps more war than anything else. Since independence, it has something like 40 years of war in South Sudan. It was then born as an independent country, but then immediately descended into civil war. Ethiopia has a history of conflict. Somalia, as you all know, very long history of conflict. So I tend to look at this region known for conflict a little bit differently. It's also a region of opportunity. There's 210 million people, 200 billion of GDP, a very large area of arable land, gold exports, a growing middle class, rapid urbanization. Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa. It was the second fastest growing country in the world for quite a while. So there's great potential. The question then is, how do we convert these opportunities into sustainable peace? I believe that private sector development, and that is one part of the sort of triumvirate that Professor Eimicke was talking about. But the private sector can contribute to economic growth and job creation, which can then lead to social stability and a reduced likelihood of conflict. A thriving private sector provides jobs, economic diversification, which can contribute to more stable and peaceful society. I think all peace needs to be anchored in jobs with dignity, and ultimately a growing middle class that demands individual and property rights, freedom, and accountable government. I also believe that technology is a game changer. We've seen it throughout Africa, but because of these conflicts, and Sudan had been under sanctions, Ethiopia, because of its own kind of ideological stance, had kept foreign banks and telecom operators out. So this region hasn't really availed itself of the technology revolution that has actually taken place throughout Africa. And it's entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs in particular, that see things differently, both, I think, politically and economically. But they're innovators, and it's those innovators that I believe will change society and create a much more broad-based growth. There is an alternative, of course, and there's really no substitute for improved governance. So you can't only do it the private sector. The government side of it and civil society need to play their role. The alternative is what they call predatory states that maximize the revenue of the group in power, and I think this largely does apply in the region, regardless of the impact on wealth of society. So without the consent of the people, you end up seeing patronage networks or repression, sometimes sort of mollified with subsidies, which was the case for Sudan. But ultimately, markets don't clear. Only people who can enforce their property rights depend on the regime. So you get very narrow, unequal private sectors, and it's all about connections to power. And you know many examples of this: Indonesia under Suharto, Tunisia under Ben Ali, Egypt under Mubarak, and Sudan under al-Bashir, all of which were overthrown by popular revolutions led by youth who really saw no future, had no agency, and the state as a job creator basically couldn't keep up with population growth and demands. And this is a picture I took in a street in Khartoum that I lived on. There's the security establishment, and a large security establishment was taking a lot of the oil rents at the time, put up this massive sports complex, very sophisticated, one of the most interesting, or like a modern, let's say, buildings in Khartoum. And as this very poor, migrant from Eastern Sudan, as you can see, with his dress and his camel, just walking across it with even a dilapidated street with poor running water. The lack of investment in what basic people need and basic opportunities, while at the same time, those who had access to power building themselves very nice sports complexes. So the question then is, since state-led development models have left major gaps, can these be transformed into opportunities? These countries, for example, electricity, Sudan, 45% of people in Sudan don't have electricity, especially in Darfur, the area of conflict. 84% of Somalis don't have it. Only 7% of South Sudanese have electricity. In banking, it's similar. Most people are unbanked. 80% of Sudanese don't have bank accounts. Only 6% or so of South Sudanese have a bank account. Yet everybody, or many people, have phones. So it creates the opportunity for a different type of solution: off-grid or mini-grid power, energy efficiency, mobile money, payments, logistics. And on that basis, we decided to create the fund. And we saw most recently Ethiopia starting to awaken, opening up internet subscription. Number of ICT firms started booming, e-commerce, digital financial services. We also saw, since the revolution in 2018, entrepreneurs really start to take off in Sudan. We saw people going from 500 to 2,500, and now last year was more like 5,000 young people deciding to set up companies. And that those that are exiting, those incubators, these sort of small shops that help them gain business skills, who are exiting and were doing quite well. So we saw that opportunity and started to put these things together. How can entrepreneurs help solve the major development gaps given what's happening? And we've seen across Africa. However, because of the political history, and 75% of venture capital in Africa really only goes to 4 countries. And in East Africa, 1.1 billion goes to Kenya, compared to only 14 million for Ethiopia and Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia combined. Even you add in Uganda, we're still less than 100 million compared to that 1.1 billion going to Kenya. So this perception of political risk, we believe we had an obligation to try to solve this. We do have the obligation to show some examples of how venture capital can be done, can solve problems for real people, and can be successful, and start to attract that as a driver of innovation and growth in the region. So we set up this fund, seed stage fund, to back entrepreneurs that we believe are leading that economic transformation, leveraging our local footprint and our knowledge of the situation. I'll give you some examples of things we're looking at that hopefully speak to the framework. The one people know a lot about and sort of helped lead the digital revolution was M-Pesa. The government of Kenya allowed a telecom operator, Safaricom, to allow money to be moved, digital wallets to be created on their system. So instead of people waiting for the banking system to be built out, they basically started banking on their phones. And this is the first few years of it. Of course, now it's well beyond this. But in the first few years, 41% of Kenya's 42 million people had already started using digital financial services. The effect of this was tremendous. 2% of Kenya's household were lifted out of extreme poverty through mobile money services, basically by aggregating funds and be able to move off farm into some off farm activity. They have women's savings groups and other things. That the ability to move money on the phone created the opportunity also to accept payments and therefore become an entrepreneur. This has been this 2% statistic is shocking. There's so many development activities that don't do anything close to lifting 2% of people out of poverty. This is an MIT study done quite a while ago. In our region, we look at some of the issues. Sudan has very abundant agricultural resources, 120 million head of livestock, 200 million acres of arable land, only 30% of which is exploited, substantial rainfall and water. But the issue is productivity. Only 7 kilograms of fertilizer are used per hectare. And when you compare average yields of, let's say, sorghum, kilograms per fadan, which is the land unit, for an average farm, it's only 100 kilograms. But for a modern farm, it's 4 times higher, 400 kilograms. For sorghum, for average yields are only about 200 kilograms, but the modern farms that are actually using proper fertilizer and other inputs are getting 1,000, basically getting a metric ton out of those same land units. Then how do we then increase productivity? So we're investing in a company called Air, which produces a low-cost drone that then has a 83% reduction in fuel costs, reduced carbon footprint, more efficient use of inputs in order to help address that productivity gap. And let me see if I can run this without taking too much time.
We're not seeing the video here.
Okay.
We're just seeing the screen.
Okay.
Okay, we can see it now.
I think, I mean, that's probably enough to know what that solution is about. Are you now back to the slides?
Yes, we are. Thanks.
Okay. Let me go to another one. So, Air is a very small company and looking for capital to be able to basically build out the number of teams that it can develop and run this solution. Another one we've invested in, or in the process of working through the investment process. And I think, as Professor Eimicke said, African cities are growing. The environmental footprint of those urban centers is growing as well. Africa is urbanizing a lot. So by 2030, 300 million families need a dignified place to live. This company we've invested in, Cubic, turns plastic waste into low carbon buildings. They basically create a sort of modular plastic brick out of recycled plastic that replaces the traditional cement blocks and walls. And so they use this for schools, low-income housing, 100% plastic waste, 5 times less carbon, and 40% cheaper than the existing solutions. They just won Entrepreneur of the Year in Amsterdam. As I mentioned earlier, only 77% of South Sudanese have electricity. But UN missions, which are quite present in South Sudan, spend about 1.6 billion globally annually in fragile states on energy. So this company called Energy Peace Partners is working with the UN to use this demand to spur the local renewable energy industry. Instead of diesel generators, to use that as a demand base where local renewable solar off-grid industry can then emerge and also sell electricity locally. So it starts to close the access gap by leveraging the presence of large sources of demand. Another entrepreneur is using village markets. This same company, Energy Peace Partners, is developing what they call a Peace Renewable Energy Credit, which helps to finance the transition from diesel to renewables in conflict settings. They basically pre-monetize the carbon credits that companies need in order to meet their social obligations. I mean, this isn't only by investing. We actually need to invest and actually roll up our sleeves and help these companies. Company we invested in called Hodorji, that they do fruit and vegetable supply chain delivery, help to restructure their marketing, moving them from individuals to supermarkets. We had to register them, do something about their governance, obtain a matching grant, and now they've been tripling their revenue. So these are real entrepreneurial possibilities. It's just that nobody has helped them resolve their capital constraint, which then, if you look at, okay, I work with a few companies, but if you look at this over history, then you see why we have a narrow private sector and are quite vulnerable to the sort of predatory type of politics that we have. So the early pipeline, we are very concerned about the companies we're looking at in Sudan, but it's also Rwanda, South Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia being actually the biggest share, logistics, payments, clean tech, energy. Those are the main sectors we're looking at. And we believe these partnerships and the possibility, we focus on these sectors because those are gaps that the government has really left unaddressed in the region. And until those gaps are solved, I believe we're going to continue to have cycles of conflict. So again, the impact. First of all, we want to create great institutions and jobs with dignity, work on high impact sectors, creating community, better governance that puts people first, and then finally demonstrate capital or venture capital as a driver of innovation and economic transformation. I think that's it. I'll leave it at that. And I think we'll be really interested to participate in to answer any questions or participate in this dialogue.
Yes, thank you very much. I think there's a lot of information in there, and there's a lot of questions and ideas that come out of that, and different ways that people can invest and contribute to bettering the world. I wanted to give Dr. Eimicke a chance first to respond to that presentation with your thoughts. So, Bill, would you like to share some thoughts?
Well, for me, these are Professor Amin's examples are just what we're talking about in social value investing. In the end, I agree with completely with what both of you have said, which is, jobs, a sustainable living wage, and then opportunities to collaborate with government, because government has to play a role here, right? The private sector can't necessarily solve all the problems that we face. They can help, but they need partners. And whether government comes in or the philanthropy comes in with risk capital, the government comes in with gap closing, maybe money for infrastructure, right? Maybe government comes in with tax incentives for sustainable energy solutions. But what the private sector, the drones are a great example. The plastic construction. I think entrepreneurship and innovation generally comes from the private sector. Not 100%, but the idea that you can invest your money and make a significant return creates a big incentive to do things differently. So I think we can be led by the private sector in terms of new ways of doing things that are more efficient and job creating, and then the government to maybe close the gap, or if you will, edge up the salaries through the tax system. You really have a combination that can address all of our major problems.
Mm-hmm. Sure. There's a couple of questions we've had, or comments that have come in, about the need for having a stable government in place. And with these kind of public-private partnerships, what happens when the government changes? All right. So I think one question was directed here to you, Dr. Eimicke, about, how does the change in a political party who's in power affect these projects? And then the other question here, which I saw from Jim Edgley, is asking, it would seem that these things require a reliable, non-predatory government partner. So I'm going to ask Magdi to address this one first. So how does your investment strategy work? How is it constrained by finding these reliable government partners to work with?
So we're investing at the seed stage. So part of the response is really that, by seed investing, we're trying to plant seeds that would take a few years to develop and emerge, and hopefully there'll be some improvements in governance over time. But I think the deeper answer to that question is that there are some sectors that do depend a lot on stable government. And I would think about it both in terms of risk and duration. So if you're going into a 30-year infrastructure partnership to build a telecom, or not a telecom, but let's say a bridge or a toll road, you need a very stable government, because the risk premiums to finance that would make it prohibitive. You would end up charging a lot for users of that service to make it viable. But there are other things that are more divisible or more resilient, or may have quicker payback periods that are more appropriate for riskier environments. Telecom tends to be one of those. You end up seeing very quick payback period, and they're very divisible. If if part of the network is down, it's still workable. But in general, you would look at the risk environment, the extent to which that investment would depend on if it's a very long term, would that demand from government be there for a long time? And in the case of, we wouldn't probably do the plastic investment, which does require a factory. Right now in Sudan, under today's circumstances, it's actually going to Ethiopia, and it has long-term buyers for low-income housing and schools through UNICEF. So we feel like those conditions are there. But I think the broader point is right. For the real long-term, high-value, high-impact investments, ultimately you need improvements in government over time.
Yeah, I recently watched a podcast video about Rwanda, where they were talking about a company called Zipline. Are you familiar with them?
Yes.
And that really astonished me, not so much because of the company itself, but because of how Rwanda has transformed over the last 20 to 30 years. I think many people are familiar with the Rwandan genocide and the incredible animosity and violence that existed in that country. But today, they have completely reformed the country, rebuilt the infrastructure, and they are actually on the cutting edge of a lot of technology and developments in Africa. And it gave me a lot of hope. And listening to your stories about, Ethiopia and Sudan and these places, you really feel that there is a potential for these places in the world to be transformed as well. So Bill, a question to you, I think, was around the idea of using these private partnerships for public-private partnerships for other areas. So Dale Garrett here is asking, the tunnel between France and England was mainly funded by the private sector. Could other tunnels between, for example, Japan and Korea, across the Gibraltar Strait and the Bering Strait and other places be funded in this way as well? Do you think that that's an option?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the channel really is an appreciated accomplishment of humankind in the 20th century. The partners, public, private, dozens and dozens of companies and dozens of countries had to enter into agreements. When we talked about the stability of government, clearly stability is important, but it doesn't have to be consistent as long as there's honoring of the rule of law. Part of what's enabled Rwanda to grow is that whether, there are debates about how democratic their government really is. And I don't want to get in the middle of that debate, but it's been stable, maybe not democratic. And it's been stable in recognizing the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts. Same thing with Channel. There's been a lot of conflict, whether not necessarily violent, but conflicts and governmental change and lack of democracy in Europe, but yet the channel continues to operate and has never been interrupted. So even if the government, the way the government functions may not necessarily be what a lot of us would like, at least if contracts are honored, that can really get you through tough times. Just one very quick example. We can see both the pluses and the minuses here when we look at how technology companies are moving from mainland China to India. Again, there are lots of critics of the government in the mainland China and lots of critics of Prime Minister Modi in India. But the private sector is making their choices to move to India because they believe that their contracts and the courts will continue to function whether Modi's there or not. They're not so certain about what will happen in the future in China. And I think actually that's creating pressure on President Xi to maybe rethink his movement toward greater autocratic government.
Interesting. I think that this month, India also surpasses China as the most populous country in the world.
Absolutely.
So,
with the youngest workforce in the history of humankind, youngest.
Yes, this is true. I believe also the Horn of Africa has a very young demographic as well. It's one of the highest birth rates in that part of the world. And so that is both a good thing and a problem, right? Because you do have a lot of youth, but if those youth are all unemployed, then it creates issues as well. So I think, Magdi, one of the things you're looking at doing is job creation, right? As part of this effort.
Yeah, and I think there's a generational shift in how people look at solving problems. I think there was previous generations a reliance or trust that the government would ultimately be the provider of healthcare or jobs or education. I think this generation, so the median age is about 19.7. And so the country really belongs to youth. It's that they're not in charge. I think they do need a bit more agency, and in order to give them that agency, their capital constraint needs to be resolved. Over time, I think that some rule of law, of course, is ultimately needed. We can't, and businesses can't thrive in conflict. But when we get to some reasonable level of stability, you can start creating the kind of transformation that you've seen in Rwanda. And Ethiopia was well on its way. It just got derailed by some of this ethnic fragmentation, and I think it is long-standing and deep-rooted. But at the same time, because of that young dynamic, the youth, the population dynamics, I think the possibility of change and just taking another look at some of these old enmities and other ways of thinking that frankly haven't served the region very well.
Sure. Which kind of brings me to another point. Dr. Eimicke, I got your book, all right? Looking at your diagram here, and I noticed that you've got process in the middle. And I would have put people in the middle because I think people have a much bigger part to play than process. People create it. What are your thoughts on why did you do that?
Well, a couple of things. I don't disagree with that entirely. The reason why we put process in the middle is the idea that if this partnership is going to work without a comprehensive strategy, without a strategic plan, it's almost impossible to keep all the different players moving in the same direction. Even if all the people involved have the right things at heart, their organizations have separate standard operating procedures. They have different missions, really, right? Private sector primarily to make money, the social sector primarily to help people who other people don't help. The government has a political agenda. So without a organizational plan for the three entities, I think you fail, regardless of even if you have the other four. So that's why we did.
So the process kind of transcends the people. So even if the people move on to other jobs or other positions, the process continues, right?
Yes.
Magdi, in your experience in working with these companies and things, how important are the people as opposed to the process?
Well, I think the people are essential to be people-centered in terms of, I think there's, to your point, in what we do. I work on technology, and there's a tendency these days to look at technology as a sort of inevitable black box. AI is going to take over, and we'll all lose our jobs. Eventually, the machines will think for us. I think you have to put people in the center and understand that whether technology or other forms of business really depends on the choices we make, whether as investors or technologists or consumers or policymakers, we frame the future. And if we decide that AI should be doing all our thinking and taking all our jobs, well, then maybe it will happen. But it is really ultimately a product of other people who then may be subject to policies or guidance or ethical considerations. So I definitely put people at the center and put our ability to make good choices at the forefront of how we should be talking about developing the private sector or technology.
I see. Yeah, I think there's always a debate. Is it do great leaders shape history, or do the events take place because of the culture of the times and the things? It's the time that this should come into being, right?
Yeah.
So I see in many companies it's a bit of both, right?
Yeah, it is. I think it is. And this looming fear of AI, I think it is really misplaced. I agree with Magdi. In fact, you look at it, look how Google has changed our world, but it's still shaped when you do a search by the decision rules that we put into the program. So maybe the best solution is one that didn't pay Google for advertising. The advertising one comes at the top. The machine left to its own devices wouldn't do that. And I think the same thing holds true with these chat boxes. I'm not as fearful of our students letting machines write their papers. They may use it to start, just like we use Google to start. But the machines are constrained by the information that's put into them. So information is constantly changing. And I'm not so sure that their learning capacity and their creative capacity will outstrip their parents, which is us. So we'll see.
Great. So I'd just like to wrap it up. We're at the end of the hour here. So Magdi, could I ask you, what is it that gets you up each day doing this? What is your why for doing this?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I wish I had only one. And my family tell me I need to also cut back a few of these whys. But I think really it is what I was just focusing on, that I think that we're at a moment where, because of developments in technology, that giving young people or entrepreneurs or innovators a chance to help transform a small service, a way of doing something, whether it's how you fertilize a field or whether it's teaching them algebra, that small change can have ripple effects by attracting others and build up a movement that then can help move us from a cycle of poverty and conflict to one where people have some dignity in work and some agency and some choice in how their societies emerge. That's what I'm after. In the short run, we would like to just get a few of our companies to be home runs, so that, you know, the kind of returns that would attract other people to the region would then would then that spark of takeoff and let the venture capital start to take off in the region.
Sure. We need to create a win-win situation where people see that this is not only a good thing to do, but it's actually going to bring benefit back to themselves in the long run, right? And Dr. Eimicke, would you like to make some closing remarks as well?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and I also believe this isn't it. The world that we see is not all of eternity, right? So I believe in ethics, and I believe in God and those things, and that keeps me going. And I think ultimately, though, just as a pragmatist, the more opportunities that more people have, the better the world becomes for everybody. And you could have unlimited wealth, but if you don't have safety and security, and if your back isn't covered by your neighbor, you can be eliminated very quickly. So it's in all of our interest, whether there is a future beyond what we see or not, to do good by each other. Doing good is also good business and good self-interest.
Yes. And I think that's a good place to close. So thank you very much, both of you, for your contributions. And we will have another webinar at the same time next week. If you are interested in participating in that, we focus on different areas each week. And so this slot every month is for our IAED, but our UPF organization in general has a webinar every Tuesday at this time focused on different aspects of society, politics, or religion, or economics. And so we encourage you to sign up on our website at us.upf.org in order to get information about those programs. So thank you very much. And I hope to talk to you both again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.